All
Friend.
right, cool. Let's do this. So, welcome everyone to Everybody Has a Story to Tell. This presentation is all about developing your very first presentation. So, my name's Andy Yoon. I'm going to be with you for the next hour or so, babbling at you about a whole bunch of really cool stuff. And, of course, here's some information about me, but most of this is not really relevant for the context of today's discussion, except for this one piece here. I've been speaking since about, 2014 or so. It's not the length of time. It's note that I've been working in this technology for much longer than that prior to getting into speaking. The reason I like to point this out is think about, well, what was I doing beforehand? I was just like all of you, attending sessions and learning, right? So, especially, going to SQL Saturdays, user groups, and things of that nature, and learning from all sorts of awesome people. And to be perfectly honest, for the vast majority of that earlier period of my career, I looked up to these people and I thought there was no way I could ever get in front of a room and talk about something, right? I'm no expert. I'm here to learn. And these people, they know so much more than me. But one thing did come to mind, that's something that I could do. I could at least become friends with all of these awesome people, these experts that I looked up to, right? Because it's not all about what you know, it's all about who you know, right? So, hey, there's all this stuff I don't know about, but you know what? I know someone who's an expert in this subject, or I know someone who's an expert in that subject. And because we're cool with each other, we're friends, I could drop them a quick question. So it was, learning how to become resourceful in that regard. So I started volunteering at events because, hey, it doesn't take an expert to take lunch tickets or to be a moderator in a room or something like that, right? Anyone can volunteer and help out at these events. So I got involved. But over time, as I got involved, I started learning about these experts and becoming friends with them and figuring out that they're not that much different than I am. They have questions too. There's tons of stuff that they also don't know. They use Google just as much as I do on a daily basis to look things up, right? And through that, I kind of, they came off that pedestal, if you will, and I started realizing that, hey, we're all kind of on the same level because we're all constantly learning. Also through this journey, some folks started suggesting to me that, hey, I have my own story to tell. I have things that I have learned that I can share with others. And they started planting that idea and that seed with me of like, you know what, maybe I can do this too. So back in 2014 or so, I actually finally did put a presentation together and gave my very first presentation at a SQL Saturday. And, since then, here I am. But this presentation isn't about me. This is about you and helping you develop your first presentation. So here's how I'm going to help you. And this is going to be our agenda for today. I've split this up into 4 different chapters. I like to kind of follow a process, and that's kind of what I'm going to be laying out for you. First, we're going to talk about creating your idea. Next, we're going to talk about developing your subject matter. Third, we're going to talk about building your content. And then the final segment will be about presenting your session, okay? So I am going to move very fast. I'm going to warn you right now because this is a 60-minute time slot. I will easily bump up under that because there's about 75 minutes worth of content in here. At this point, I just say, you know what, sorry, I'm going to move fast. But this is recorded, so you can always come back and check things out later. So with that, let's get going. Oh, yes, there is a worksheet that's up on my GitHub. You can go grab this now. The GitHub URL is now in the lower left-hand corner of every single slide from here on out. So just go to the developing your first presentation repo, and you can go get my little worksheet there. You can grab it now. You can grab it later. But, it'll be something that'll hopefully help you out as you are hopefully building that first presentation. Okay, so let's talk about creating your idea first and foremost. A lot of folks, when they first started, are like, well, I don't have any ideas. What should I talk about, right? Well, think about some of these different questions. When was the last time you taught someone something? Usually that happens on a more frequent basis than you think about, because when you teach someone something, it's not oftentimes like the classroom setting. It's the, hey, did you know this? Oh, cool, I didn't realize that. It could be those quick little tidbits, those tips and tricks, right? Well, of course, we're all learning new tech these days. There's all sorts of things that are evolving in our industry. And, there's also, lessons learned from working on major projects, migration projects, a new application, new builds or whatever, all sorts of things that we are doing on a constant basis. The key, though, when it comes to your very first presentation is make sure that you choose a topic that you find interesting. Because if you pick a topic that you're kind of about, it's going to increase the risk that you will wind up becoming disengaged during the process of developing the session. So the more passionate and the more interested you are personally about this very first topic of yours, the more engaged you're going to be over the long haul as you go through the process of putting everything together. Now, if you're still kind of, at a loss as far as what your first presentation idea should be, take one of these. This is my favorite presentation idea. How many times have you told someone, stop doing that, please don't do that anymore. Stop doing this, stop doing that, something like that. Build a presentation around that. That's actually what I did way back when, because the thing is I worked with a lot of .NET developers who didn't have a good appreciation for why data types really had an impact on performance. So I built a presentation all about data types. This kind of, was kind of my story. So think about those things of like, no, please stop doing that, because we all have one of those, right? And build a presentation around that. Now, let's take it beyond just that initial idea. It's all about telling a story, your story. You want to weave in your experiences as much as you possibly can. Well, what if I'm learning something for the very first time? You can also tell a story of your learning journey as well, right? There's a lot of different stories that can be told. It doesn't have to be something you've been working with for 10 years plus, right? You can just talk about, how you went about learning X, Y, and Z and the mistakes that you made along the way. Or again, if you're talking about things like projects, you can talk about things that that were challenges for you. And, hey, next time around, if I ever have to do this again, I'm going to make sure I'm not going to do this, this, and this. So learn from my mistakes. We all love to learn from each other's mistakes, right? And, you can also talk about why you're even interested in the idea in the first place. Why do you find this compelling? Do you see use cases for this new tech or this particular, setup? Or is this a really cool way to accomplish the same old kind of thing, but hey, you're doing it in a completely different way that, wow, I never thought of this before and it wound up working, right? It was that harebrained scheme. And now I want to share that with you, right? So think about those things. Now, this says set expectations. What do I mean by that? Sometimes you come up with a fantastic idea that's really cool and really compelling. And then, you put that presentation together and then, you wind up giving it somewhere and maybe like 5 people show up. And sometimes you wind up feeling a little disappointed. And this is why I like to say set expectations, because if you pick a really cool topic, understand that it may be a bit of a niche topic and you may not draw as wide of an audience, but that's okay. You got to also keep that in mind. Many of my presentations are kind of niche presentations, to be perfectly honest, and it's all about quality versus quantity. Your goal should not be to fill a room of 100 some odd people. Your goal should be to fill a room of people who want to learn from you, and that is the key. And if that day it happens to be 5 and the next day it happens to be 15, and the next day maybe you're lucky and happens to be 500, it doesn't matter. These are all people that want to learn from you. So remember to set those expectations for yourself, depending on what topic it is that you choose. Because of course, there are some generic topics out there that are always going to be room fillers, right? The perf topics and whatnot. Now, on the other hand, most of the topics that are out there, you're going to say, well, there's tons of people who've talked about this stuff before, right? It's all been done before. Well, when was the last time you threw in a particular question into your favorite search engine? You came up with a whole bunch of different results, right? So you start reading the first result here, and it makes absolutely no sense to you. It's a bunch of gibberish. So you read the second one. Still doesn't quite make sense to you. It's not clicking with you. You keep going on to the experts blog and so on and so on. And finally, you get down to that like 5th or 6th or whatever. And finally, whatever that person wrote makes sense to you. Oh, I get it now. Each one of those articles covered that same exact topic and attempted to answer that same exact question. But it took multiple different authors to finally get to an author who wrote it in such a way that it made sense to you. And you could be that key author to someone else because you're going to have a key way of explaining things. I love silly analogies, and some people love my silly analogies. Others, it doesn't really work as well for them. So you know what? I am not that, not that expert, to that person, but I am that, the person that makes sense to some other people, right? And that's okay, right? So again, it's how you tell and how you explain things that will be unique to you. But I keep using this term expert, and I'm no expert, right? So this just happened yesterday, this Twitter exchange. I didn't get permission from the original poster just yet, so that's why it's been anonymized. But someone out on Twitter, a friend of ours, tweeted this out yesterday. And, they were having some self-doubts. A number of us in the community responded, and this was my reply: to tell your story anyway. I for one, am definitely not the best person out there, but you know what? I still have things to share. And then I also built upon that with a couple of other thoughts that came to mind a few hours later, particularly the idea that, you know what? The people that I'm constantly learning from are not necessarily always the best people. Or a different analogy is, or a different thought was this. Many folks I'm not one of them, but many folks happen to have children, right? How often do parents learn from their own children? Think about something like that, because you don't necessarily have to learn like the encyclopedia of all the factoids. Sometimes it's just that one or two little nuggets that make the entire presentation worthwhile, right? I mean, I've said in my fair share of presentations where, yeah, most of it's review, or I've kind of seen this before, I've been exposed to it, but oh, that 5 minutes right there, that one was totally mind-blowing for me, and that's what made the entire presentation worthwhile, right? And it couldn't have been given by someone who is more of a peer, right? Remember how I talked earlier, a lot of these people that we look up to as experts are just like you and me. They're using Google every single day. They're asking their friends for for advice, for information, for things that they also don't know, right? So again, you don't need to be an expert. All right, so now that we've gotten all that aside, let's focus on the story that you will tell. And there are two methodologies that I like to utilize. The first one is called the focus statement, and the second methodology is what I call rules of engagement. So the first methodology, the focus statement, we're going to fill this out together. You're going to take your idea and put it into this template. Every blank should or must blank because blank. So again, take that idea that you happen to have and fill it into this template. So let me give you an example. Every every production DBA should or must understand how to back up and restore your databases, because if you can't back up and restore, you got nothing in a disaster recovery scenario, right? That's a very simplistic example, but you see how I'm trying to frame it. You're defining several different things through this focus statement, right? Based upon what your idea happens to be, right? So think about that and think about how that might apply to you. Every blank should or must blank because blank. Now, if that one doesn't work for you, or if you want to try a second methodology, I came up with something called rules of engagement. And the rules of engagement entail giving answers to 3 different key questions. What do you want to talk about? Essentially explain in 1 to 3 sentences what your core topic happens to be. I may want to talk about indexing because this is something that's an underrated topic in the industry, blah, 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 right? I'm making something up, right? Now, the second question is, why do you want to talk about it? And the why takes two different halves. First, why do you as a presenter want to talk about this? I want to talk about it because I keep running into people that have misconceptions about indexes and how indexes really work underneath the covers. But the other half of the why is also to think about, why should an attendee come to this session, right? And then the final aspect, or the final question, kind of ties into that second half. To whom do you want to talk to about it? Who is your target audience? Is it a database developer? Is it an operational person? And what is the ideal level of expertise? Is it someone who's never seen an index before? Is it someone who's been indexing for years and knows indexing in and out, right? And you want to take it to the next level, that 500 level brain melt, right? So think about answering each of these as well. So you can, again, take one or the other approach, or sometimes when I'm developing a session, I'll do both. And once I write all of these out, and this is where that worksheet comes into play because I have everything on that worksheet. Once you write all of these out, this will help guide you through the rest of the presentation build, okay? So I'm going to re-review them. The focus statement is every blank, should or must blank, because blank. And then the rules of engagement are what, why, and to whom. And if we were in a live audience in a room, I'd be making you all repeat this after me. So hopefully you're at least doing it in your minds. Okay, so at this point, now let's talk a little bit about marketing and selling your idea, which really entails coming up with a title and an abstract. For what it's worth, you technically don't have to do this at this point. I know some speakers who actually won't even put together a title or abstract until much later in the development cycle. But this is as good of a time as any to address that. And oftentimes, people will put together a title and abstract before they build a presentation because usually they're submitting it to like events or major conferences and stuff like that. And oh, once I get picked, now I got to build a session, right? So in either case, this is flexible, but it happens to land here because I had to pick a place. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the title and what makes for a good title. There are two schools of thought: catchy or cute, or direct with facts only. I used to be of the former mindset, but then as time went on, I kind of shifted my mindset and my bias towards the latter. Also, do you want something that's short and sweet, or do you want something that's a bit more lengthy and descriptive? Now, understand that many conferences will oftentimes have character limits, so you're somewhat constrained by that, and that can be a bit of a challenge at times. But there's a reason why I like direct with facts only. A title, in my opinion, should really communicate what this presentation is about. And here's a key reason why. Most of us will only ever look at a session title because we will only ever look at a schedule kind of like this one, right? Many of us will never click into the abstract and bother reading the abstract. A lot of folks, or some folks will, but frankly, a lot of folks do judge a book by its cover. So therefore, a really good presentation should have a really strong title to draw your audience in, to communicate to your audience exactly what is this presentation about. And that is why I am of the bias of direct with facts as much as you possibly can. If you can weave in a little bit of wittiness and a pun or two or something like that, go ahead, but make sure that that the title, no matter what, is still direct and communicates everything. So again, that's my opinion. So a quick example, something that's a little catchy, a little cute is your queries, your indexes, and you. Does that really communicate what a presentation is really going to be about? Yeah, I see queries and indexes, but okay. Okay, here's an alternative though. How indexes actually help your queries. Okay, using the keywords how, is something that can, okay, now I can get a better sense of how, or what this presentation is all about, right? Just by adding that one keyword in there. It's very, very challenging to come up with a good succinct title, right? But it's a challenge we all face. Now, moving on from the title, let's talk a little bit about the abstract, because while a lot of attendees may never read your abstract, there's one or group of people that always will, the people who pick your session, right? So a good abstract, in my opinion, happens to have three segments: the hook questions, the agenda statements, and then the takeaway promises. So let's talk about the hook question or questions first. This is the opening portion of your abstract where you're trying to identify who your target audience is. And here's an example. You're trying to get people to think, does this apply to me, right? So this is, again, where you need to think about your target audience and think about some questions that you want to ask them to say, because you want to hopefully people to say, yeah, I think that applies to me, right? Because then you want to then draw those people in. Next is the agenda. This is where you want to clearly communicate exactly what this presentation is going to be about. You don't necessarily want to give away spoilers, right? But you do want to be very clear and upfront about these are the main things we will be covering, right? So, because I don't know about you guys, but I have walked into presentations where I thought it was going to cover X, Y, and Z, and it winds up being all about A, B, and C instead. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to accidentally or unintentionally mislead our potential audience and have them walk away disappointed. And speaking of walking away, your attendees should always walk away with something, and that's something called the takeaway promise. So, if you give me your time, I will convey to you, or I will give you a certain set of knowledge, a certain set of skills, a certain set of tools, or whatever the case may be, so that when you leave here, this is what you will walk out with. What will you go home with? Hopefully something practical, but even if it's a theoretical type presentation, new knowledge about something or whatever the case may be, right? But in either case, you need to communicate, this is what you're going to go home with. This is what you're going to walk out of here with, right? This is our goal. Now, when it comes to putting together a really solid title and abstract, a lot of us, myself included, will rack our brains and try and come up with stuff, but we're not sure if it's good enough. So don't go it alone. Ask for help. I do this on a fairly regular basis. You can always go to coworkers and friends, of course, even non-technical friends, because sometimes even someone who's looking at it from a non-technical perspective, if they can understand what your abstract is about, even if they don't understand some of the jargon, some of the technical terms, then you know that you've come up with a good abstract that can at least clearly communicate things to someone who is not of the same technical background. I love to make use of Twitter, of course, and I will constantly ask questions out there, and you'll see that I've done that in the past numerous times. There's also the SQL Server community on Slack. This is one of those other resources that are available. I don't spend as much time here as I would love to, but again, there's a lot of different resources that are out there, a lot of different places where people gather, and here's just a couple of examples to go seek some help. Okay, so let's recap here. I talked a little bit about the abstract format, of the importance of making sure that you come up with some questions to draw in your target audience, and then clearly communicating what the presentation is going to be about. Because again, we don't want people to walk away disappointed, thinking that it was going to be about one thing versus another thing, and then ensuring that you clearly communicate, this is what I expect you to walk away with. Okay. So let's now recap the entire little chapter that we just covered and talked a lot about picking an idea and focusing, and hopefully helping you get away from or move away from the potential imposter syndrome of, well, this presentation or this topic has been covered by 8 bazillion other people who know tons more than me. It doesn't matter, because you still have a story to tell, and you may be able to communicate it in a way no one else ever has. And then, of course, we talked a little bit about title and abstract and kind of bringing that all together. So at this point, this is a great point for me to pause and ask if there are any questions.
You do have one. So this is from Ravi, which is, what is your suggestion for handling hecklers or people in the audience who ask irrelevant questions?
Fantastic question. I will get to that in a future chapter, so hold on to that one. So that's coming up a little bit later.
Great.
Right, thank you, Andy.
You're welcome.
That's the only one you have so far, so you're good.
Fantastic. So let's move on to chapter 2, developing your subject matter. Okay, we have an idea. Now what do we do? So now that you have that starting idea, you need to start brainstorming to fill that idea out with supporting material. So you need to first come up with some subtopics, right? And so here's some, ideas for subtopics, or like ways to approach a subtopic for that overall idea. And when you're first coming up with subtopics, do try and limit yourself to 3 to 5 subtopics at most. The reason for that is this. A typical presentation will be 60 minutes in length. And that if you have 5 subtopics, that really only gives you 10 minutes at most per subtopic, plus intro, plus closing, plus time for Q&A, right? That's actually not a lot of time. You might think it's a lot of time, but heck, I'm looking at the clock now and it's already been 25 minutes. Wow, where did all that time go, right? When you're presenting, time will fly. So I strongly suggest that you limit yourself, especially the first time out. Again, this is all about creating your first presentation, right? Limit yourself to just 3 to 5 major subtopics, right? Now, when you're still coming up with the initial material, though, and you're brainstorming, I still say build up more material now, and then worry about cutting it down later. Because I would rather, build out that presentation, build out what I think is going to be like 80 minutes worth of content, and then when I finally, do my first trial run, wind up, oh, I only had 40 minutes. I need to, find more, rather than the opposite of like, I got about 70 minutes, so I can cut some of this content out instead. I'd rather have the luxury of cutting things out, rather than trying to scramble and figure out how else do I pad and add more content to a given presentation. So during the brainstorming phase, which is where we're at now, I prefer to try and err on the side of try and come up with as many ideas as possible, and then we'll cut things down. So what kind of material can go into these different subtopics that we talked about? Well, here's a couple of different examples, right? Analogies, use cases, personal stories are key. As many personal stories as possible. Personal stories are something that people can always relate to, right? Because people want to hear your experience, right? Now, when it comes to this brainstorming phase, I encourage people to write down everything because you never know when a good idea will come to mind. There's been numerous times over for me where I come up with a random idea, just like a one-liner or something like that, and I'll write it down in my OneNote. So I use OneNote a lot, and I have a page that I call snippets. That's all I'm doing. Sometimes I'll write a paragraph as an idea. Sometimes it's just a stupid little one-liner or something like that. It's just a little reminder, such that later on when I bring everything together, I have record of that. Because you might think, yeah, I'll remember that. I never remember that type of stuff. And you have that brilliant epiphany and then it's lost 5 minutes later. You don't want to lose those. So if you have that brilliant idea, oh, I should talk about this or I should make this point, make sure you write it down. Now, many folks have heard the phrase content is king, right? So, we got to focus on building the best content possible, blah, 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 right? Well, I argue that content is not necessarily king. What is king in the idea of, building your presentation? The focus statement and your rules of engagement. All content serves the king, right? So we're following a silly little metaphor here, right? Or a silly little analogy. So the point to that is this: as you're coming up with these different ideas, and then eventually when you start editing those ideas down, if you feel that that idea, that subtopic or whatever is a little bit tangential, that's a little bit going off topic, it is not serving that. It must go back and tie back directly to your rules of engagement and or your focus statement. You don't want to meander and go off on subtopics. That's really the key point to this little segment right here. Make sure that whatever content you are picking, whenever you're doing the editing phase, serves your focus statement and your rules of engagement. Now, when I go back to saying tell it like a story, telling a story, of course, has a beginning, a middle, and the end. And it usually has some kind of flow and things build on each other, right? So there's a couple of different ways that you can kind of try and structure a presentation to build on things that you've referenced in prior segments. You notice that if you're being mindful of what I'm doing, I'm actually doing that very intentionally in the context of this particular presentation. I've also very explicitly created chapters here. I'm doing some things in a very heavy-handed fashion, of course, to also illustrate things and demonstrate actively as I go through the session. And when you're building that story, there's a couple of different ways to organize your thoughts. The first way is an outline. Most of us are familiar with this particular methodology. Some of us like it. I happen to be a big fan of using a traditional old outline, but some folks hate outlines and detest them. So if you're one of those people, or you want to try something different, the second methodology that I was going to show you is to try using the idea of a storyboard. If you've ever studied like filmmaking or anything like that, you'll know that people come up with storyboards as they're putting different media together. So we can do our own version of a storyboard using some note cards. Write down those key snippets, those demos, those ideas, or whatever it is. Write them down on a bunch of different note cards, and then just lay them all out onto a table or something, right? And then you can start grouping them together. Like, some of these things might go well on a same slide here because some of them might be a talking point. Other things might be, a slide point or something like that, and so on and so forth. So start grouping them, and then you can start reordering them and visualizing how this might come together. I'm like, does this make sense if I talk about this here and then talk about that there? And again, because many people are visual, many people will find this methodology useful. Some people may not, and that's perfectly okay, but I want to, kind of show you how it can be very useful. The other tip that I'm showing you here in this slide is to take photos along the way, because there are many times where I'll have an arrangement, and then if I didn't take a record of it, I'll come up with another arrangement. I'm like, wait a minute, no, this doesn't work as well. How do I go back to what I had before, right? We all have cell phone cameras these days, so just take a bunch of pictures as you're going along, so that way you can remember exactly what it is that you did before, because maybe you want to go back a little bit and mess around, or and take a segment of that, and so on and so forth, right? So take plenty of pictures as you're going along, and that'll help you record your progression and regress, or go back if you happen to need to. Eventually, you're going to come up with something that you like, and of course, make sure you record that as well. Okay, so let's recap this chapter real fast now. So we talked a little bit about subtopics and focus, and making sure that your content serves the focus statement and or your rules of engagement. That's why it's really key to come up with those and define those early on. And then we talked a little bit about forming a story using either the outline method, the tried and true method, or try a storyboard if you don't care for outlines. So with that, let me pause and ask if there are any new questions.
Yes, you have another one. A bunch of presenters talk on similar subjects. So how do you avoid falling into the pitfall of plagiarizing someone else's content? Or at what point is material considered plagiarized?
So I'm definitely no expert on the term on plagiarism. Now, one thing I do try and do, if I ever, for example, borrow content or I'm inspired by content, I'm actually going back to, well, it's actually much earlier. Whoops, it was in the prior chapter.
I remember this. I saw it.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to do that right now, but I'll go back to where I'm at now. But basically, like, the focus statement is credited to Buck Woody. That's who I learned it from, and that particular presentation is referenced in the in the resources slide. There's another presentation I did long ago that I did a demo that was based upon a demo that Paul Randall did. I dropped him an email. I said, hey, Paul, can I use this demo? I will change things around, but I'm fundamentally going to kind of keep it the same the same structure, because that's essentially what it was doing. And he said, yes. So in the comments in the header, I said, credit to Paul, it was inspired by Paul, with modifications and that sort of thing. So if nothing else, always try and err on the side of caution. But it goes back to explain things in your own way, if at all possible, right? Now, if you're directly quoting someone, or don't lift their slides, come up with a new slide or something like that. Like maybe someone's got a great diagram. That's fine. Don't copy and paste it. Try and adapt it. Put your own spin on it, right? There's one new speaker out there, Haney. She does phenomenal hand drawings and stuff like that. Like, hey, you could always do something like that to adapt or whatever. So yes, again, I'm not an expert on the topic of plagiarism, but I always try and err on the side of caution of of crediting people, trying to get their permission whenever possible, and if not, directly crediting them and being very clear that this is actually someone else's material that I'm representing. Be very clear about it. But again, try and avoid that as much as possible. That's how I try to approach it.
Right. Thank you, Andy.
You're welcome. Anything else, Aaron?
That's it.
All right, cool. So let's continue on. Chapter 3. Let's talk about now building your content. So first of all, when it comes to building, let's talk a little bit about PowerPoint and PowerPoint considerations. So we have all of the different things that we had from the outline and the storyboard, right? And we need to kind of prioritize it. There's essentially 3 different levels, if you will. What is going to be an entire slide, basically like the title, and then, the slide is going to be all about this, like the PowerPoint considerations. What's going to be a bullet point? It's something that you kind of talk a little bit about, but you want to make sure that you call it out explicitly on the slide. And then what's the third and final element where it's not on the slide at all, but it's something that you are going to talk about? So you got to think about, which element ranks in what in one of those 3 kind of categories as you're going through the different snippets and other details that you wrote up in your storyboard and your outline. Now, I am personally of the bias that when it comes to slides and the amount of volume of content you put onto a slide, that less is more. There are 2 schools of thought. Some people like to put lots and lots and lots of content on their slides. Other people, like myself, I prefer less is more, because the thing is, while people are reading a slide, they're not listening to you. So even though reading a slide only takes so long, it can still potentially detract from you. And in my personal opinion, you are the reason that someone is attending the session, not your slide deck. If I wanted to read a slide deck, I'd go read a blog post instead. Now, what about the takeaway promise? Because there's a lot of people that will go back and review content. Not everything is recorded, especially if it's like a live user group or something like that. So you know what? Some people would like to put in more content in their slides so that people will have more notes, right? Well, one thing I like to remind folks of is that, inside PowerPoint, there's a little notes segment that you can fill up with tons and tons and tons of extra information. Of course, you can use it as your own cheat sheet as well. That's how a lot of folks, myself included, will use presenter view in PowerPoint and throw notes in there as well. But again, keep in mind that you can leverage the notes field in order to throw more information in there. And of course, you can also make use of more reference slides at the end or additional handouts, PDFs, or things of that nature to give them all of that extra content later on down the line. But again, part of this is my opinion. And again, there are two schools of thought. There's neither really a right or wrong, but you do need to decide which way you're going to go. This is where I always take an obligatory sip of water or coffee in this case and let you read the slide, because this slide kind of communicates everything in of itself. The point is to make use of PowerPoint animations to hide content before such that you don't let your audience get ahead of you, right? So, get a little PowerPoint clicker or just use your mouse if you don't want to invest in one of these. But make sure that you learn how to do basic PowerPoint animations to control the flow of information. Because if I have a slide that's full of like 6 or 7 different bullet points, but I spend 2 minutes talking about the first 2, people have already read ahead in a fraction of a second and they may get ahead of you. And if they get ahead of you, that increases the risk of them disengaging from you. Because, oh, I know that what this person is going to talk about next, and then their mind starts wandering, and you never want to lose your audience, right? You want to keep them with you all along the way. So that's why I'm a strong believer in using PowerPoint animations to control the flow of information. So now I'm going to share with you a key design technique when it comes to putting your presentations together, especially your slide decks, but also the presentation in general. Tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you just told them. This sounds really redundant here, but this actually has its roots in education. The idea is that you're setting things up. You're kind of giving someone, hey, this is what we're going to be talking about. And then you talk about whatever it is that you're going to talk about. And then you recap and reinforce it. You're driving it back home, right? And if you've been paying attention or you think back, I've been doing this very intentionally in a very heavy-handed way throughout this entire presentation. But, obviously you don't have to be as heavy-handed as I am. I did that somewhat intentionally, but it really helps to drive the point home. And in fact, I'm even going to do it to you now in a much more heavy-handed way to talk about my PowerPoint pet peeves. There are 2 key PowerPoint pet peeves that I happen to have: font size choice and color choices. So in these days, because we're all sitting in front of a computer, these fonts are pretty readable. But in the, think about in live conferences and that sort of thing, some of these fonts may not be very readable, especially if you're sitting in the back of a room of a large conference center or like an old school classroom or something like that. What if the projector is kind of lousy? What if lighting conditions are not ideal? Those smaller font sizes will be much more challenging to read, especially if you're like me and my eyes are not as sharp as they used to be. I wear contact lenses, so but otherwise, if I wore glasses, they would be rather thick. So think about that sort of thing. Now, the thing is, when most of us are developing our presentations, we're looking at a computer screen, right? So, it still seems like, at a quick glance, an 18-point font seems perfectly readable. So here's a quick tip and trick for you. Take several steps back and then look at your a slide deck from that perspective. Is that still as readable? Pretend that your eyesight is not 20/20 if you happen to have 20/20 eyesight, right? Pretend that lighting conditions are not as ideal, and so on. And then think about how readable something is as you've taken that step back, as you pretend that to be an audience member sitting in the back of the room as opposed to the front of the room. Color choice matters as well. I really despise when I've been forced to use corporate issued PowerPoint templates where people have not been conscious or aware of color choices, such that the background and the font color do not have very good contrast in between one another, making the text very difficult to read. And then I listen during these presentations where people say, I know you can't really read this slide, so here's what it says. If you ever have to say that, you've made a dramatic error. You did not build a slide very well because it's unreadable and there's no point to it whatsoever. So be very conscious of that. So you see how I created this little grid here. Just drive home the point of different basic color choices and what reads well and what doesn't read well. In the end, keep it simple. Go with a white background and a very dark font color. So what are my so to wrap up or recap, what are my PowerPoint pet peeves? Font size, of course, be clear, choose very large fonts so that things can be readable, and always be aware of color contrast, right? So contrast is critical. And if you ever say that your slides are not readable, so here's what it says, you've made a big mistake. All right, so the other topic that I want to talk about when it comes to building your presentation is demo considerations. Most of us are doing technical presentations these days, so we need to build demos for them. And I want to strongly encourage you to budget adequate time to build your demos, because here's the thing. It's very easy to write code that is extremely terrible. It's much more difficult to write code that sucks just enough to illustrate the point that you're trying to make, as opposed to something that'll run for 30 minutes, an hour, or something like that, or to create these disaster scenarios that you're trying to show how to fix, but that you can't necessarily reproduce. It's a one-shot only. You need to, you'll find that creating a demo can actually be quite challenging. So budget some extra time for this. If you're doing code-based demos, I strongly suggest that you comment your code very, very heavily. There's, of course, different schools of thought when it comes to commenting your code, but I argue that you should comment it heavily, not only for your audience who may be going back later to review what you did, but also for yourself, especially as a first-time presenter, because you can use it as your own cheat sheet to say, oh yeah, I remember, this is what I'm going to talk about next, and be shameless about it. It's perfectly okay. Make sure you create a strong reset mechanism of some sort. Some people will say, oh, I can just do a database backup and restore or whatever, but that's not my personal approach. I personally prefer to create some kind of script that is immutable, such that I can just rerun it, as many times as I need to, so that I can make sure that I return to a proper start state. So this is an example here where I always create a reset script of some sort and has everything in here, including cheat sheet and notes, because of course, if I do a presentation and I don't touch it then for another 6 months and I come back to it, what did I do in here again? So comment the heck out of things, remind yourself, because I don't know about you guys, but I'm kind of forgetful. So this is my preferred method, but figure out something that works best for you depending on what it is that you're doing. Okay, so let's recap the build chapter briefly. So remember that key PowerPoint design consideration. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them what you told them, which is exactly what I'm doing here right now. What were my PowerPoint pet peeves? If this was a live audience, I'd make you all repeat it after me, but of course it's font size and color choice. And then, we talked about some other PowerPoint and demo considerations as well. Budgeting enough time, if nothing else. I always find that coming up with really good demos takes a heck of a lot more time than I ever anticipated. So let me pause at this point and ask if there are any questions.
Do you recommend a live demo, or how about a pre-recorded demo in case of a situation like no internet?
Fantastic question. So so there's a couple of different schools of thought on this one. And for the context of a first-time presenter, I would challenge you to still try and do a live demo. Now, there are cases, of course, where if you need internet access for whatever reason, like you're doing something with Azure, then yes, having something pre-recorded would be a very good idea. And in fact, you may just want to do a pre-record of one of your practice runs, something I'll get to in a minute. So just have that on standby as a backup. Now, if you're not necessarily doing something that's like an offline or like that's an online kind of thing, like me, I'm just doing T-SQL type stuff and whatnot. Sometimes having a recording won't do you any good if the disaster scenario is like your laptop completely crashes and that sort of thing. So, or again, just a demo just not behaving the way you expected because SQL Server decided to do something unexpected or something like that. So the other thing that I would suggest is just making sure that you know what you should be seeing in the context of the demo and be ready to pivot and say, hey guys, I'm sorry the demo gods are not with me today. This is what you would typically be seeing, X, Y, and Z. I do apologize. And then, make the promise to follow up later, write a blog post or, post up, a corrected demo or something like that. If you do not happen to have a recording on standby. I also say that because I just don't care for recordings myself, but that's a personal opinion only. Recordings definitely have some value. I just happen to be recording phobic. Ben knows this quite well. Sorry, inside joke. Anyway, I hope that helps to answer your question.
Yes, thank you.
You're most welcome. Any other questions?
You're good.
Fantastic. All right. So let's move on to the final chapter now. Now we're getting to actually presenting your session and some considerations when it comes to presenting. And of course, before you actually get to the presentation day, you need to practice a whole hell of a lot. And you need to practice it the hard way. What do I mean by that? A lot of folks, when they come up with that presentation, they'll think that practice is good enough when they're sitting in front of their computer, they're kind of clicking through the slides, they're mentally going through it and whatnot. Whereas when I say practice it the hard way, you need to stand up, you need to pretend that you're actually talking to a true audience, and you need to go through everything, word by word and that sort of thing. And as you do this, practicing will help you identify weaknesses. To be perfectly honest, the first time I ever do a trial run, usually the first 2 or 3 times actually, I ever do a full trial run of a brand new session, I never finish because I start talking about something, and as it comes out of my mouth, it's like, ooh, that's kind of awkward. Or you know what, now that I'm hearing it come out of my mouth, what sounded good in my brain definitely does not sound good anymore. Or, oh, that is kind of confusing. That is really awkward. I should change that up. So, again, it's perfectly okay that the first couple of trial runs, you wind up changing up a bunch of stuff. That's what happens to me every single time, right? Because again, how many of you have had those situations of like, that sounded good in my head, and then when it came out of my mouth, ooh, that wasn't so good, right? Practicing will also help build your confidence, because the more you practice it, even if it's not the greatest practice run, the more you practice it, the more comfortable you will get as far as giving this material and reciting this material and sharing this material. You don't necessarily ever want to be reading off of a script. However, for a first-time presenter, one tip that I do like to share is to memorize your first 5 minutes. Something like this can oftentimes help people get into that groove, get over that initial like, oh my God, I'm so nervous and whatnot. So have that first 5 minutes locked down hard, because oftentimes with many things, once you get into that groove, you're good to go, right? So, this is one of those tips that may work for you. Give it a shot, and again, just have that first 5 minutes locked down solid, and then you can kind of free flow a little bit beyond that, right? Another tip is to learn Zoom it. I'm a big fan of Zoom it, especially in live conferences. There are so many times when people are like, I can't read that, or especially for, not only looking at just slides, but things like management in studio and whatnot, because you can do all sorts of cool stuff like zooming in on different segments and such. But I also am the big fan of using the draw functionality to draw arrows and boxes and that sort of thing to highlight the things that I'm really talking about, especially in today's day and age, of course, where we don't have the luxury of doing live presentations and I can't use a laser pointer to point things out. I like to use Zoom it. But even in live presentations, I don't like to use a laser pointer, because lasers, you can't always see them anyway. And I can also persist the drawings as I'm doing in this example right now, such that you can let the point sink in rather than having to hold that laser point and keeping it pointed at something. This is a completely free tool. Go download it and check it out and learn how to use it. And that was my one demo for this session. All right. So let's move on to feelings. And how are you feeling? Because, the session is coming up soon, and you may be feeling nervous. So these are some tweets that I'm using with permission from my good friend Jess. She was about to give a presentation to my old user group, the old Chicago Suburban user group, and give this particular presentation for the very first time. It was a practice run essentially for the Next Pass Summit, and this is what she tweeted out publicly a few hours beforehand. As you can see, she was quite nervous. Even the most seasoned presenters, people like Jess, people that I look up to, because Jess is definitely one of those people I looked up to, can have nerves, can have self-doubt, and that sort of thing. And that's perfectly okay. Accept the fact that you will be nervous. The only thing that ever really changes in my experience is the volume of time that you're nervous. Like before I presented for the very first time, I was nervous for at least 24 hours beforehand. Nowadays, I still get nervous, but now it's maybe only like a half hour beforehand, right? But I definitely still get nervous. Even before this particular presentation, I still got nervous. But what I encourage people to do is try and shift those nerves into excited energy in some way, shape, or form. There's many different things that people like to do. My old roommate Arthur loved to listen to comedy routines on YouTube to get his mood up and to kind of shift that nervous energy into excitement. I have a particular playlist that I like to listen to with some different songs that kind of get me energized and jazzed up. Figure out what works for you and try and figure out a way to get yourself into that mindset to convert that nervous energy into excited energy. And then, rely on self-affirmation statements. These are the silly, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me kind of things. But you know what? These things really do work from a psychological perspective. Remind yourself that you were chosen to give this presentation by someone who believed in you. There are people that are coming to this room that want to learn from you. They want you to succeed, right? So keep those things in mind. Repeat them to yourselves. Remind yourself of it. Use stick-it notes if you're, like little Post-it notes, or write a couple of them down so that you can see them in front of you and visualize it. All right, so this is, so during the presentation, what is the greatest fear that most people have? The dreaded question, or the curveball question. Someone had asked about hecklers earlier on, and this kind of relates to all of that, right? So, a lot of us are very, very nervous. How do we feel those? How do we deal with those? I argue that you should do your best to not fear questions. Remember, whose side is your audience on in the first place? They're on your side. They're there to learn. There is the rare case that you will encounter some kind of heckler or some hostile audience member. But here's the thing. Typically speaking, those hostile audience members are really only present during, with presenters that really are, seasoned presenters, because it's an ego thing that they want to show them up. They want to show up those big names, right? If they're really doing that kind of behavior to someone who's presenting for the very first time, what does that really say about them? Ask them if they have the courage to get up on that stage and give that same presentation, right? So, I don't encourage you to get hostile, but keep that mindset in mind. You at least had the courage to get up there and, put yourself out there and share your story and your material. And again, it's extremely rare that a heckler will bother someone who is a first-time presenter, right? As opposed to someone who's been very seasoned. And if you're seasoned, you already know how to deal with hecklers anyway. It's okay to say, you know what? I don't know the answer to that question. Own what you don't know. How many times have you dealt with someone who tries to BS their way through an answer and you see right through it? You don't want to do that. Instead, own the fact that you don't know that, but then take responsibility for it. You know what? That's a great question, but you know what? Let me do some homework for you. Let me get back to you. Come see me afterwards. I get my contact information. Maybe I'll write a blog post about it, and so on and so forth, right? Take ownership of it and follow up, right? Or this is actually my favorite. Ask for some help. There's a whole audience and room full of people that are just as smart. Remember, these are all people that are just like you, that want to learn, that are also asking questions, that also use Google just like you do. Ask your audience for help. There have been numerous times where I'm like, wow, that's a crazy edge case. I've never seen that. Anyone in the audience happen to know the answer to that one? Audience members also want to help out too. They want to see you succeed. And I've had many times where people say, yeah, I've seen that. And here's the thing. And then I'll say, thank you. I just learned something in my own presentation. That was awesome. Even though I'm the presenter, don't be afraid to learn something yourself, right? We're all here to learn in some way, shape, or form. So once you're done, you of course or usually will have different questions, and there's always going to be some kind of room for improvement. Make sure that you try and write down the questions that you do get afterwards, or more ideally, if possible, ask a friend to write down those questions for you. It's actually kind of funny. I learned this trick from Erin and some of her colleagues, seeing them do that at some conference many years ago. I'm like, that's so brilliant. It's like so simple, but it's like, oh yeah, duh, ask a friend to write down the questions that you get, right? So of course do that. That way you can review them later. Again, you can do follow-up, write blog posts, or whatever. Listen objectively to your feedback, and I want to emphasize the word objectively, because what a lot of folks will do is that they'll get like 10 pieces of feedback. 9 of them will say, yeah, you did a great job, and then one person will say, I didn't like this, I didn't care for it. Oh no, I did a terrible job, because I'm going to focus on that one thing. try and listen to things objectively. Remember that you got 9 people who love the session. Not everyone is going to always love, what it is that you talk about. Remember going back to that earlier slide about, asking a question and, seeing multiple different, result sets in the search engine, and, certain things will speak to certain people, but not everything will, everyone will speak the same to everyone else, right? There will always be someone in the audience that, again, your way of communicating just may not work, and that's okay. Listen objectively. And if a piece of feedback gives you constructive criticism, as opposed to saying, nah, I didn't like that, but says, I didn't like that because of, this particular thing didn't make sense to me. Could you try explaining it this way? Listen to that, because that's at least giving you information on how you can improve, because there is always room for improvement. I've been giving this particular presentation for a couple of years now, and every single time I give it, I've always changed something up a little bit because I've learned. I was even making changes last night to tweak a few things from the prior time that I gave the presentation. Apologies for that. By the way, remember Jess from earlier? After she gave that session at my user group, this was her subsequent reaction, right? So I wanted to kind of circle back to the Jess story from earlier. It went great. She identified weaknesses. She got a bunch of great feedback, and she improved the session. Because again, we all have room for improvements, even people who have been doing this for 10 plus years, right? Most importantly, after you've given your very first presentation, celebrate, because you have just done something that most people never will. Think about how many people are out there in the industry, how many data professionals that are out there, and then think of the subset that are actually people who are out there giving presentations and speaking. There's not that many of us. We're a very, very small percentage. I want to help grow that percentage, of course, which is why I put stuff like this together. But celebrate the fact that you still did something. You still did something awesome that not a lot of your peers will ever decide to take on or attempt. Right? So celebrate that fact. Hey, you may have stumbled here or there, but that's okay. You still did it. And that in of itself is definitely worth a couple of rounds of beer or whatever your drink of choice is. Anyway, so let's recap the present your session segment. So practice, practice, and practice some more. For what it's worth, I forgot to mention this earlier, I budget many, many hours when it comes to presenting and putting together a brand new session, upwards to 40 hours or so. Yes, that much. And at least 10 hours will be devoted just to practice, okay? It's okay to be nervous. You're going to have a lot of nerves. Embrace that. You're going to get questions. Embrace that too. And also embrace the fact that you may not know the answers and that it's okay. Own that, and then keep in mind the different strategies on how to handle that, some of those things that I shared with you. So let me recap this entire presentation. We talked a bit about creating your idea and some of the different things. We talked a bit about the focus statement and rules of engagement, and hopefully trying to bury the self-doubt of these ideas have all been talked about before and that sort of thing. We talked a little bit about developing your presentation or your subject matter, focusing on a handful of different subtopics and making sure that your content, serves the focus statement and or your rules of engagement as you've defined them. We talked a little bit about building your content, of course, making sure that you have enough time for your demos. What were some of my PowerPoint pet peeves, by the way? Font size and color choices. And what was that PowerPoint kind of design consideration? Tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them what you told them, right? And then finally, we just talked a little bit about actually presenting your session, considerations, practice and that sort of thing. So I hope this particular session has given you a good workflow, a good process, a good point to start as far as building that first presentation. But I do want to leave you with one other key parting thought. You don't have to do this alone. Find a mentor. I had a number of people that have helped me out throughout the years, and that have mentored me. I'm an active mentor as well because I strongly believe in speaking. Actually, I'll give a call out to Erin right now. She gave me a phenomenal tip many, many years ago before my very first virtual presentation of how do you deal with a virtual presentation where you can't see your audience, you have no idea whether people like it or not. And Erin told me, pretend that your audience loves every single word that you're saying. It will psychologically keep your own energy up, and therefore, it becomes that feedback loop. And hopefully people will feed off of that energy, right? So thank you, Aaron. I've been sharing that advice and crediting you with that for many, many years now, and it's helped me out even today, right now. So, but in either case, find mentors. It doesn't have to be singular. I should have said plural, because there are many people that can help you out, whether it be with ongoing regular sessions or even just those little tidbits like what Aaron shared with me, right? But there are many of us who are speakers that love to help out other speakers, myself included. So I want to remind you that I have a resources PDF that has tons of URLs for all sorts of other blogs, recordings and sessions and other things like that about other people who have also presented about presenting, right? So go to my resources or go to my GitHub repo, find the resources PDF and go download that for even more content, other perspectives on how to get into presenting. And with that, I want to say thank you. I managed to clock in at 60 minutes. That's fantastic. And I'll take questions at this point.